Welcome again. My name is Stu McKenzie. I'm the Science Manager with the Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis, or CINA Center, which is headquartered here at George Mason. Thanks for joining us as we continue our Distinguished Speaker Series. To stay informed about upcoming talks in our Distinguished Speaker Series, please sign up for our mailing list. Of course, you'll also find details about our research and events on our website. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Hardy. Jeff is the Director General of the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, where he manages a unique multi-sector business approach to tackling these issues. Before this, he served as the Director of the International Chamber of Commerce's Business Action to Stop Counterfeiting and Piracy. He's also served as Director of the ICC G20 CEO Advisory Group, President of IDA Consulting, and in several roles in the U.S. Department of Energy. Now, we're going to forgive Jeff his Bachelor of Science in Economics from Illinois State because he also has a Master's in Public Administration and Policy from George Mason. Just kidding, Illinois State folks. Gilded the lily, so to speak, by receiving an honorary degree from Energy Policy from the Oxford College of Petroleum Studies, as well as the U.S. Secretary of Energy's Silver Medal for meritorious service during the Gulf War. Jeff, it's an absolute honor to have you with us this afternoon. I'll just mention your talk is called Illicit Trade in the Forms of Trademark Counterfeiting and Copyright Piracy. And if you're ready, Jeff, I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so it's nice that you mentioned George Mason. I was just looking back and trying to calculate how many years it was since I graduated from there, 1987. So I think George Mason and I were the first students to attend. Anyway, so it's a real pleasure. It's been really amazing for me to watch this university grow and become such an active player on the global policy agenda. It's really been, made me very proud. Let me say that as a person. In terms of the work of CINA, you know, I clearly, it seems like you go much broader than the area of illicit trade, but I think there's a lot going on in the illicit trade space that overlaps with criminal activity. And I think it was just within the last week or so even that the Secretary General of Interpol has called the illicit trade in vaccines the liquid gold of organized crime, because these organizations are seeing, you know, an enormous amount of seized opportunity taken by these criminal groups from Mexico to the Balkans to Southeast Asia. So there's one message that I've picked up on, and I've always tried to repeat, regardless of how salient it is, in every webinar that I've been on recently, is that you cannot buy vaccines online. Anything you find online is a fake. So pass that word on to others. It's not like going on Amazon and trying to figure out whether a latest fashion apparel or something is fake or not. This is pretty unequivocal. So also, I wanted to just shout out to Dr. Louise Shelley, I see, who's in the attendance. I mean, I've known Louise for a long time, had an opportunity to speak to some of her students about a year ago. And for all of you GMU students, I think you should be quite proud to have her as a resource on staff. She's widely regarded as one of the leading academic experts on illicit trade, if not the leading, especially for someone who's so well published. So, you know, George Mason to me continues to just do a great job pioneering key issues, and I'm happy to be able to participate today. So I put together some slides to talk you through some of the things I wanted to share. It's a, you know, it's a fairly long block of time that we have, 30 minutes or so. So I thought I'd spice things up with the PowerPoint. And in that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the organization on top of the nice introduction that I just got. I want to tell you a little bit how we work, and I want to highlight some study that we did about a year ago on illicit trade in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to do that because there's one goal in particular, SDG 16, that translates directly to criminal activity. And then I thought at the end I'd talk a little bit about some of the observations we've had during the pandemic, illicit trade specific observations, and maybe even share a couple of lessons learned, at least from my perspective. Like I said, let me start off by talking to you a little bit about Trace It. I mean, um, there are a lot of different organizations out there that deal with various aspects of illicit trade. And the longer I worked in these different sectors, the more apparent it became that there were various crossovers and synergies and similarities in counterfeiting or falsified medicines or illicit trade in forestry or even fishing. And we had realized that there was no sort of unified approach in dealing with these commonalities, and that's what gave birth to Trace It. So as you can see from this slide, our approach is to tackle 12 different sectors of illicit trade with two objectives really. One is that we want to make the business member companies of Trace It smarter and better able to partner with governments. And when I say smarter, what I mean is, what is it that one sector can learn about the other in terms of, the similar organized criminals or similar trade routes that they might be experiencing. And the other objective was to make governments more effective. Since we I don't think we have government officials on, so I could say we want to make them smarter too. The realization there is there's probably no fewer than 20 international conventions and another dozen or so intergovernmental organizations that deal with illicit trade. But there is very few examples of where they are taking a joined up approach. And that's been our objective, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. Just to give you a snapshot of the type of companies that are members of Trace It, you can see here. In each case, the member companies are, one, they're vulnerable to illicit trade. Their supply chains have been vulnerable. And two, they are active proponents against safeguarding their sector. So what we do is we address some of the common vulnerabilities across the different sectors, right? So as you can see from this slide, any type of illicit trade can be transported via maritime cargo, container shipping. So we look at that. Same thing with air and land transport, express carriers. Internet platforms are increasingly, the way consumers get products from, illegal wildlife or shark fins to your typical counterfeiting products. We also while we're working on this, we're looking to expose and uncover associated crimes. So along with almost every form of illicit trade are the associated crimes of financial fraud and money laundering. In many cases, there's associated human trafficking and specifically forced labor. And in fact, we are right in the middle of producing a report that we hope to publish with the International Labor Organization that specifically reveals how illicit trade is driving forced labor around the world. And then organized criminal activity, we're going to talk about that more later, and corruption. So the way we go about our work program is that we seek to drive the international agenda. And the reason that this is a main part of our strategy is, as you can see with each one of these icons here, these groups are comprised of member governments, and they're responsible primarily for promoting, promulgating standards, guidelines, policies, best practices. So if we can get inside these organizations and work with them constructively to support their mission, then we can do a better job of getting our messages to national governments and national capitals. The other component of our work is to drive the advocacy through unique, fact-based research. This is just a small number of the publications that we put out recently. But in each case, what we're trying to do is we're trying to very clearly lay out the parameters of the problem so that policymakers have a basis for lawmaking, publishing regulations, or more importantly, resourcing and prioritizing these regulations. So you see this one on the left is very interesting publication. We just came out less than a year ago, looking at fraudulent advertising on online marketplaces, in particular social media. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this yet, but if you haven't, you may not even be aware that while you're scrolling through your Facebook page or your Instagram pages, you are increasingly being exposed to fraudulent adverts that are look just like any other kind of advertisement that we're increasingly inundated with while we're on our social media platforms. But these links take you directly to rogue websites that are designed specifically to sell fakes or to steal your identity or your financial credentials. So these are just some of the studies we do. Let me point out one more on the right. That's a report we published in January on the link between illicit trade and sovereign credit ratings. What we found here is that countries that do a better job of fighting illicit trade across the board have higher credit ratings, and those that don't have lower credit ratings. And it's an interesting report if you want to have a look at that. But the purpose of that is that illicit trade, criminal activity, is not a type of thing that can be tackled by one ministry on its own, one department here in the US. But it's usually a multifaceted problem that takes the attention of trade ministers, customs, foreign affairs, um, comptrollers. And in this case, we're trying to draw the attention to finance ministers and to explain to them that if they also enter the dialogue and are supportive and recognize the need to fight illicit trade, that they can also reap dividends in the terms of better credit ratings. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of the type of work that we do, driving the international agenda, the policy work that we do that underpins our advocacy. And I thought then I would move to move the presentation to talking a little bit about one of our most powerful reports that we've published here at Trace It. And it's this one that I have on the screen, Mapping the Impact of Illicit Trade on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The icons are kind of small, but as you can see on the left, those blue ones are the 12 sectors that we work in and companies we represent. And on the right side of those are the UN Sustainable Development Goals that are directly undermined by illicit and illegal activity in those sectors. We published that report in collaboration with the UN Conference on Trade and Development. We held an event about a year ago in Geneva, attended by 55 member states who have endorsed this work and are now calling on the UN to make this a official priority part of the work program at UNCTAD. And the reason that that's significant is because that hasn't existed before. And the purpose of UNCTAD would be to be the custodian of this issue in a way, and to bring together many of the other UN-based agencies in Geneva, New York, Vienna, under a common umbrella and a common goal, laced together by this commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And the way we came about doing this report is actually quite interesting. I mean, we would travel to national capitals primarily on invitation by either a government agency or a business organization that wanted to learn more about how to fight illicit trade. And I and my staff would sit in meetings like this. This one happens to be in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and listen to the various ministers talking about the problems that they faced. And I've got them here in bullet points: the job losses, the economic losses, the the drain on tax revenues that you're probably quite familiar with, squandered national resources. It's interesting to just hear country after country, minister after minister talk about the problems, the detrimental problems to the economy and society from illicit trade. And as I said in meeting after meeting, it sounded to me a lot like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, who are oriented toward fixing all of these problems. So we started to take a deeper dive into the issue and started to ask key questions, of how deep is this problem and how much is it correlated to what the world is trying to accomplish in terms of the development goals? Are any of the impacts interconnected? How about developing countries? Is it harder for them? So we looked at all of this and, basically reached the conclusion that they were all impacted in a negative way, some more than others. You can see from below, conflict diamonds are in the category of precious metals and gemstones. They're probably the illicit activity that has the greatest impact on the goals. But right behind that is illicit trade in petroleum, counterfeiting and piracy, agrochemicals. As you can see, it's a major, major drawback to the world's development goals. We also showed that they're very interconnected. You might not think about falsified medicines and illicit alcohol in the same, mind space, but in each case they undermine human health and they undermine progress toward the goal. Same thing with hunger, food fraud, agrochemicals, in other words, pesticides that help grow food, all undermine our goals for zero hunger. And I'm trying to work toward a transition to criminal activity. And this slide is that transition slide, because what we found is that of all of the 17 SDGs, 2 of them were impacted by every single type of illicit trade. And, in my introduction, I described the sectors that we work in, but there's other forms of illicit trade that we don't deal with, and that's arms trafficking, for example, and narcotics. And those are also impacted. SDG 8 for economic growth and SDG 16. So that is what I wanted to start talking about is SDG 16. So that's the goal for peace, justice, and strong institutions. It's oriented toward eliminating criminal activity. It's oriented toward maintaining the rule of law, peace, prosperity, ridding the world of corruption. And this is very closely tied to, I think, the work of CINA. And if you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to look more closely at that goal, because it creates enormous amount of opportunities and other connections to fighting criminal activity. So the next few slides that I presented almost 1 month ago to the day to the UN Congress on Crime Prevention. This is a Congress that happens every 4 years. It's hosted by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. It was held in Kyoto. It was quite a disappointment to be participating in this prestigious event from my home office is instead of visiting Kyoto, which I think would have been a fascinating trip. We did a session on illicit trade criminality and SDG 16. Some of the panelists that shared the stage with me were from Crime Stoppers International, the UN, and the Syracuse Institute for Criminality. What we did is we shared a new report that we published, which is a spin-off of the one that I've been talking to you about earlier, but that was focusing specifically on SDG 16 and the criminal elements associated with illicit trade, that were negatively impacting this goal. The report also included some observations that we have had over the last year during the pandemic. I'm going to share some of those with you today as well. So the next slides are really just a rundown of some things we can talk about later if you would like. They may be some topics that you all are very familiar with, or in some cases they may be new, or perhaps even in best case scenario, they might encourage further work and research by CINA. So sometimes people really don't think about food fraud and illicit trade in foods, but you would be surprised that if you have more than one bottle of olive oil in your cabinet, it's a very good chance that one of them is illicit, counterfeit, fake, fraudulent, or substandard. There are a lot of examples of sugar smuggling, coffee smuggling, palm oil smuggling, and illicit trade in these food sectors. And behind all of them are transnational criminal groups. We have some examples from the pesticides industry. Again, because of the global nature and trading nature and the need to, move product through the global shipping industry, organized criminals have been very involved here, and the profits that they can make are high, the penalties are low. Stories you've probably heard before. Counterfeiting is probably the one area of illicit trade that the everyday person knows the most about. It is the largest in terms of the financial aspect. In other words, the criminal profits are highest in counterfeiting, and the deterrent penalties are probably the lowest. There have been studies over the last few years, especially with the rise in terrorist activity worldwide. There's studies that are pointing to how terrorist networks are using the proceeds of crime to fuel their activities. So it's not just an organized criminal problem, but it's bleeding over into a mechanism for terrorists to fund their activities. I don't know if I have a slide on petroleum, but that's certainly the case in Mexico, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Nigeria, where petroleum theft, siphoning of the crude or the products are done by criminal groups and to fund terrorist activity. The fishing industry, by the same token, is a massive organized criminal activity with a huge presence of human rights abuses and forced labor. There's the one on the petroleum industry. Just really trying to highlight that the point that we were trying to make with our report, that illicit trade is undermining SDG 16. It's undermining the UN's goals for peace and rule of law. It's undermining national governments' efforts to maintain the rule of law and to implement the SDG 16 goals. The same situation is happening here in pharmaceuticals, and we'll talk about that at the end when we get into what we've seen in the COVID-19, but this is probably the most opportunistic example of criminal activity that, organizations like Europol are on record of saying exactly that they have not ever seen criminal groups seize an opportunity in illicit trade like they've seen over the last year. So this is a bit of a summary. The SDGs, like I encourage you to look a little bit more deeply into this. It's closely tied to the objectives of your organization. And each of the goals has a number of targets underneath them to stop violence, to stop the exploitation of women in this case, to build trust in legal institutions, rule of law, to stop illicit financial flows, to stop corruption and terrorism. So as you can see, this is this was written several years ago. I didn't just make this slide up. And as you can see, there are direct parallels to almost everything I've said up to this point, where illicit trade is the commercial backbone of criminal activity. I'm sure Dr. Shelley has probably written that in a more eloquent way than I'm sharing it now, but it's true, ladies and gentlemen. Reached really the last third of my presentation, which is to move over to the COVID-19 observations. So last year was a bizarre year for everyone, from the way we work to the way our children are educated to the way we shop at the grocery store. And I don't think I've been involved in any meeting or frankly any conversation that hasn't started with COVID-19. And it's exhausting. But it commands our attention. And I think that there's an inclination, a human inclination for everyone to reorient everything they're doing to COVID-19. And I really don't feel that way. And I think in the world of illicit trade, I've tried to resist making too much out of a situation that we seriously hope will end soon. But within that context, there are certainly three areas where illicit traders capitalized on the fears of consumers and the breakdowns in law enforcement, and the shortcomings of our global supply chain. So I know that every single one of you are familiar with what happened with a new acronym that we've all added to our vocabulary in the last year. I know that I've certainly never used the word PPE before, but now everyone's just talking about PPEs. Well, PPEs were one of the most faked forms of illicit trade in history. And some of these statistics I have here come from our own CBP, Customs and Border Protection in the United States, Interpol, and Europol. We intervened here early. There wasn't much that we could do except to issue some fraudulent product alerts. We did that as early as March of last year. We did our fair share as best we could to support the works of the organizations that I mentioned. We translated these documents into several languages. We used our business networks in national governments to get the word out. And that's really all we could do. The problem was so fast moving is very difficult. We can't change the rules of the internet where this trade was facilitated. It was difficult to enforce border control in some cases. But there were some terrific efforts that were done. And our hope was that we were able to help the law enforcement agencies that really stepped up to try to stop this problem. Another area was alcoholic beverages. Not so much in the United States. I think there were a couple of instances in Kentucky and Pennsylvania where some supply restrictions caused some problems. But outside of the US and worldwide, this became a major, major problem where I think we had a country count of 20 national governments had imposed supply restrictions on alcohol. Now they did this, alcoholic beverages. Now they did this for all the right reasons, everyone. I mean, every government, local or national, was grappling with ways to contain the virus. How do we do it? How do we implement social distancing? No one had ever really done this before, and part of that calculus was imposing supply restrictions on beverages. In some cases, in the worst case countries were India, South Africa, and Mexico, and Panama. We could throw Panama in there as well, where they imposed 100% prohibition laws. on production, transport, distribution, sale, online sale, offline sale. And well, a lot of you are college students, so I think your econ knowledge is pretty up to speed. What happens if you reduce the supply of one product? It's pretty simple. Econ 101, consumers pursue substitutes. Now, in the case of alcohol, in a lot of these countries that I mentioned, there was already a market for illicit substitutes. I think that number was as much as 25%. In some African countries, that number is sometimes near as 50% of the markets. So what we saw was a significant increase in criminal activity when they seized this new marketplace, or this open door for them to build their markets. There was a monumental fall in tax revenues. You even had comptrollers officers around the world kind of complaining about the government policies because of the tax losses. And then sadly, there was the increase in um, physical harm from consuming these alternatives, because a lot of them are toxic, and in some cases they're toxic enough people died. We published a report on this at the end of last year, and at the time the death count by our statistics had reached over 1,000. And then there were a number of problems, primarily in Europe, on food fraud that Olaf and Europol had jumped onto right away. So that went from some food products to also some trade in wine. And so these were some of the observations that we had of illicit activity during the COVID. I don't have a slide for this, but the other part of it was counterfeiting, generally counterfeiting. And, this was also a problem well before the pandemic. And basically, with the growth in the online shopping came the equal growth in the counterfeit offerings. So quickly, some observations. There are three things that I'd like to share about this, and one of them is that the COVID-19, the scenario around the pandemic, revealed that unquestionably, irrefutably, organized criminal activity underpins illicit trade. And as I said before, illicit trade is the commercial engine of organized crime. That came out over and over and over again. Again, studies have been published by some of those main organizations that I mentioned, including us. The other observation is sometimes, whether it's policymakers or whether it's consumers or whether it's just, the common understanding is that somehow counterfeits or fraudulent or fake products are a harmless crime. Well, that's not true, because what we learned is that there is a lot of personal injury behind this. And I think the example that we've pointed out mostly is what happens when people consume, these fraudulent alcoholic beverages and end up dying from it. And I think the third main point that we want to say is, a lot of times we're addressing illicit trade or counterfeiting, we look at it from the IP perspective, or we look at it from the trade perspective of unfair competition. But I think one of the things that stood out the most for us during the last year was, in all cases, this is about consumer fraud. And what can these, illicit traffickers do, to take advantage of, in this case, fear, to impose consumer fraud. The lessons learned, I have two lessons learned I want to share, and I think I'm almost to the end of my slides. One is that, going back to my points about PPE and fake remedies, fake COVID-19 testing kits, is that, these organizations, the World Customs Organization, ICE here in the US, the DHS, Europol, Olaf, Interpol, they cracked down on this trade like I had never seen before, delivering amazing results in a time where, people were locked down in some countries, where it might be difficult, to get to a border, do border control, or where the internet, where monitoring the internet was a job that was triple or quadruple in size, and they delivered amazing results. And I have been thinking about this, is that what the lockdown has shown us is that when these types of law enforcement agencies prioritize a problem, and when they are properly resourced, they can deliver amazing results. And I think what we need to do, my organization and yours, is to make sure that that's the case all of the time, not just in an emergency situation. So that's the first lesson for me of focus when we come out of the into the post-pandemic time, is showing everyone how effective these organizations can be when they're properly resourced. I think the other main lesson I started to talk about a minute ago is e-commerce. So for the last 10 years, especially here in America, the last 10 years, we all individually have been shopping online more and more. We've read interesting stories in USA Today about the growth. We've read about shopping malls shutting down because consumers aren't going to the mall so much, they're shopping online. And we've heard projections of how that's going to be part of our future. Well, what happened in the last year is we got a glimpse into that future, a big, serious glimpse into that future, where the e-commerce shopping numbers just went through the roof. This is what the future is going to look like and more. And the lesson to take away from this is we are currently woefully unprepared to deal with precluding and mitigating illicit trade on our e-commerce platforms, whether it's the shopping platforms or whether that's the social media platforms. So when I come out of the lockdown, these are the two things that I'm going to be pounding my fist on the table about. That is the last slide. So thanks for the invite. I'm just disappointed that we can't go throw a blanket down on the quad and hang out and chat.